Okay, so we're back here for the second half of the Chinese economy and society. So again, stuff prior to the year 1200, but again, very good background, very good information and useful information that is very necessary for understanding, more of the Chinese development more into the modern era. So we kind of ended here on the agricultural advancements lead to technology and industrial development. So we talked about the Champa rice, we talked about the Grand Canal and how that helps bring in you know better agriculture within China, helps tie and bring in cultural integration, and then leads to, again, the creation of a lot of other things within China that helps, or is kind of based on the fact that Chinese people can now do other things than just produce food. So it helps to expand the Chinese empires, but also bring stability to the area by bringing in stable food supplies, and then people can start doing these other things. So again, hopefully you've taken a look at that stuff in the book for more details, but that kind of gives you a brief overlay of that stuff. So now we're going to finish up with the written word and paper money, and then the ever always very interesting foot binding and Chinese patriarchy. So within the written words, you can kind of see examples here. This one comes right out of the book. That talks about this. So if you look in the definition of what it says in the book is a 12th century presentation from a printed book of a Chinese translation of a Buddhist text, along with block printed illustration of the Buddha addressing his followers. So what China was able to develop was essentially printing. And this is very similar to what we will see in a couple hundred years from now in Europe, when Johannes Gutenberg does the same thing with the printing press. The thing is that what China initially developed was carvings, and putting those carvings on wooden blocks, and then taking ink and then pressing it down really, really hard on a piece of paper, and then boom, you have a visual, or you have written words with it. Okay, so initially they would use the images on wooden blocks to print on paper, and then create it up with the movable type. But if you know anything about Mandarin in particular, and other types of the Chinese language and dialects, there is a lot of different symbols and a lot of different letters and signs and symbols within the language. So it gets very, very complicated that within China itself, they wouldn't exactly use this all that often. It actually became much more easier to do the printed version of the images than it was for all the words and characters, because it was just so complicated within everything. But as again examples, so like here it would be the block version. You put ink on that, and then you would literally just put paper, or put it onto the paper, and you just kind of press down against it, and the ink would print onto that. And that's exactly kind of how that works. And so you can YouTube videos on how the printing presses or just movable print kind of came into being, and you get some pretty good visuals out of it, and it does the job. And Gutenberg will do this in a couple hundred years with German, and we'll talk about the effects of that when we get there in a number of chapters far away from now. But what this does, this is really, really important within the written word, because it makes production of printed material faster, cheaper, and more efficient to produce in large quantities. So, just take an example. I'm going to use our textbook right here, Traditions and Encounters. Okay. So I got my page here. Imagine if you had to do all this hand by hand, or word for word, letter by letter, and I told you had to make 100 copies of it. Okay, and you had to just literally not even type it out and copy and paste, but you had to write it hand by, literally word by word, and you had to write it all out. That would take a very, very long time to produce, and there wouldn't be a whole lot of copies. Okay, it would take a very long time for anybody just to make one of these. All right, written by hand. So the idea is, you get a small amount of information, or a large amount of information, you get it on movable type, press it down, and boom, you're getting more and more you're getting more of it produced a lot quicker. All right, so essentially what this comes down to is religious and government texts. So think about texts from the Buddha, Taoist texts, Confucian texts, government orders, things like that. Calendars, again, always very important within agriculture. Improved in agricultural techniques, poetry, stories are now getting passed down, and this is again where we talk about knowledge of the Chinese language and the written word becoming really, really important, because this can get passed around to more people, and also emphasizes the importance of education and why people need actually to go to school in order to learn to read and write. Because if you don't know what is being done here with these words, then you don't know the information that's out there, or as much information that you can find. So it makes it a lot more accessible for more people. And that becomes essential for, again, expansion of knowledge and expansion of just other really important things within all societies. So we talk about, our modern world does not exist without, again, printed material, especially printed words. And so Europe is going to be a couple hundred years behind this, and China begins to produce in large quantities all this stuff. So how this connects itself to paper money. So as China was growing and it was advancing into many areas and trying to expand its empire, trade became easier. All right, and there was an expansion of trade within the areas. Again, think about connections with the Grand Canal, all right, Champa Rice, all that stuff. But the way in which they were, transactions with money was, coins. Think like pennies, dimes, nickels, things like that. And there was a shortage. There wasn't as much coin to go around to actually exchange your goods. So what they had to do was they came up with two really cool developments within the monetary system. The first was known as flying cash, or just credit. So essentially you have a letter of credit and you say, hey, this is worth this much and I'll exchange this at a different place for, again, coins, or I will exchange it for, a certain amount of things that are worth it, like clothes, silk, food, porcelain, fine china, things like that. So essentially it's the same idea today as, taking your credit card and say, I owe you this, or this is worth this much. And so I will take that out on credit. And that's essentially where this really gets started within Asia. Obviously, this happens in many other places too, but it's known as flying cash because it's literally just kind of flying around. And again, the book talks a little more about that within the Tang Dynasty. But again, this is kind of the reason why letters of credit become established in China, is because there is a lack of money. There's a lack of hard money in coins that they have to do that. But also to kind of help resolve that issue, because again, coins are typically coming out of metal, and there's just not enough to go around. But we now have printing. Okay, now with printing, we can make paper money. That comes with a lot of issues itself. But an example of paper money is this one right here, in the bottom right-hand corner. All right, and so paper money, again, is just as valuable in many cases, because again, it's an easier way to transact. Paper was in abundance, and again, it was just easier to print this than to actually get the metals to do it. Although there's some issues, obviously the book itself talks about counterfeit money, because initially it starts off with creditors and bankers, but then the government has to step in and say, no, we're going to be the only authorizers of this, which makes sense, because otherwise, all sorts of different money are different values, and that becomes a problem with exchanges and all that. So it becomes essential that the government runs how much the only type of currency that's kind of in concession. And then you get exchange rates and things like that, which again is its own little fun stuff. If you really want to look that up, kind of exchange rates and things like that, it's really, really cool. At least I do. But then you have your other issues that we still run into today. What about, well, if we just print money, we can just have as much money as we want. And that leads to things like inflation, and devaluing of currency, which are more complicated and interesting economic issues in and of themselves. We're not going to get into that here. But because paper money becomes so abundant and it becomes so easy to use, that it becomes the de facto type as it begins to, again, get spread. And, there are things like symbols and markings on there that become like the official mark, or that makes it more complicated and more difficult to, create and try to make counterfeit. But yeah, it becomes so abundant within China that you can't get rid of it, even though there are a number of problems that we just kind of mentioned there. So the written word leads to the invention of paper money as a result, because again, it becomes just so much easier to use and is just easier to make because of, again, all these things that we've talked about. All right. So that expands into China and beyond into other parts of Asia, and eventually we will see that in other parts of the world as well. All right. This also increases the prestige of merchants, because in China, for the most part, merchants are thought of as people who are just there to, they're lowest rung of society. They make money off of trade. Well, now they become really, really important because, again, they are examples of these people, these middlemen, essentially bringing goods from one place, exchanging for another, and bringing them back to markets to sell, or, again, to exchange these goods within different people in different parts of society. So they become more important and are thought less and less in a negative viewpoint. But still within much of China, merchants are kind of looked down upon, or they're kind of looked at as people just out there to make a profit. So that, again, is something to be aware that merchants weren't exactly the most highly thought of people. And I forgot to, put this into, putting up piece by piece. But anyway, so this comes down to the last part that we're going to talk about here within Chinese society and economy within this presentation is foot binding and the patriarchy. So patriarchy is just meaning that men are in charge, or that, lineage goes through the men. All right, in a patriarchy, it is a king that is completely in charge, or a father that is completely in charge of the family. Matrilineal, or a matriarchy or matriarchy, is women in charge. And different societies have different roles within that. So, in different levels of what that really means for importance. An example of a matriarchy, within Judaism, the family lineage runs through the mother. So you're not considered to be Jewish if your mother is not Jewish, or at least, that's kind of the more existential viewpoint of it. In a patriarchy, it all relies and follows through the father's bloodline. All right, so a son becomes more important in China because the son is more valued in a patriarchy. All right, and males dominate Chinese society, so that is the preference for boys and better treatment. And then you think about, the one China policy and, people abandoning girls and, the thieving of women because there's so many more boys to girls in China today as a result of all this stuff and the preference for males. You can definitely see that in a long-standing issue about patriarchy. You see that also in other cultures that prefer men as well, and especially on strict guidelines like this, like property ownership, but also the fact that, if a man wants to carry on his family line, he has to have a son. Daughters are for, marrying off into other families. Okay, but if you only have daughters, your family line essentially in their mind ends with the men, or it ends with the daughters because they take on and will move in with their husband and his family. All right. So women are second to men and essentially only take jobs and roles within the household. All right. So they're not supposed to be as valued as a result because they can't go out and earn money for the family by doing other jobs. It's, they are taking care of the house and they might help with some agricultural duties and chores here and there. They're not going to be out there being merchants. They're not going to be out there building bridges or getting famous for being architects, things like that. So their roles are very limited. And what this comes down to is the issue of foot binding. So obviously you can see these examples, and you can see other ones online too. And there are a lot of videos related to this issue, which is something that still unfortunately can happen now within China. But essentially this comes down to the idea of feminine beauty and fragility, and within the deference to men in the family. So essentially what they do at a young age, and this was in wealthy families, and there are different stories about how this got started within either dancers or courtesans, or one Tang ruler within the dynasty having a preference for small feet, that the way in which a woman's foot was shaped was considered to be attractive. All right, so think, in a sense, foot fetish. But this meant that women were essentially reliant upon the men in their family, because what you do is you kind of break the bones in there and you shape them. They would sew their feet together to kind of shape the way that their feet grew in an unnatural way by doing these things, and making their feet essentially look very, very small. So they would need assistance with essentially everything, either walking with a cane or having a male aid at their side. Which also meant that they really couldn't do a whole lot of jobs because, again, based on that physical deformity, they were limited in their capacity for what they could do. All right. And again, it was considered to be very attractive. Women in high society, high status, were essentially expected to follow this and have this done to them. And so it's mostly associated with the wealthy elite families. Poor families couldn't afford to do this, especially if, the daughters are, very necessary in terms of agricultural production and running the house, and you can't do that without them. But some families would, in terms of trying to attract a husband, would in fact do this at a young age, or, go ahead with this, even though it might hurt their family's chances. So it was mainly Chinese upper level society, but then it also got passed down to the lower levels. So that kind of covers the patriarchy. And again, unfortunate unequal treatment of women within China very briefly. So as always, if you got questions, let me know. Otherwise, we're going to stop the video here. So yeah, hope you found that interesting. because it's unfortunately very, very sad.